Well, over the last 40 years of equal pay legislation, I'd like to think lots of things have changed. But to be honest, sometimes I get very frustrated by the fact that organisations still haven't addressed the two key issues around equal pay. The first is that there is a massive risk around not paying women or men, depending on the gender, fairly. And the second is, and this applies much more to women, is the huge loss of talent that we see, particularly towards the top of an organisation, where senior women just seem to disappear over the years. Oh, there's so many things. I mean, there's been a huge amount of cultural work done on what reinforces the gender pay divide. For some purposes, it's about women's own expectations. So, for example, law graduates, men and women leaving university, women will accept a job on £8,000 less right at the start of their career. So they're already starting off behind the start line before they've even begun. And some of that might be about the sorts of specialties that they choose to go into. For example, family law typically pays less than corporate law. But we also see women as perhaps being less good at asking for money. They're more likely to accept a pay rise, to accept a pay level when it's offered, rather than challenging it, as men tend to do. And there's also quite a lot of historical research that shows that women tend to only apply for a job as a promotion when they think they can do 80% of it, whereas men will apply when they think they can do 50% of it. So men are just much more willing to put themselves forward. And that's perhaps something in organisations that we need to bend over ourselves to really address, rather than letting it carry on. There are lots of key indicators that organisations can look at. So around the lower levels of pay and the organisation, very often there are very similar approaches. So graduates often tend to be taken on at the same sort of levels. People's starting salaries tend to be very similar. But once you dig a bit behind that and compare a cohort of men and women who joined your organisation, say 3 or 4 years ago, what can often emerge is that the men have moved much more quickly up the organisation and are earning more than their peers when they started in the organisation. And that leads questions around recruitment and promotion and training decisions, which sometimes aren't as obvious on the surface. I think there's some other information that women can think about as well and just be more encouraged. The recent book by Sheryl Sandberg, who's the COO of Facebook, talks quite a lot about how men and women are treated differently even as children. So we all tend to tell our little girls not to be bossy. You don't tell your little boy not to be bossy. And so there's a lot of cultural development that I think we need to do, which would enable women, young women particularly, to feel more empowered as they work through the organisation. But my biggest concern is, where do women go? We have equal numbers of men and women entering and leaving universities, more or less, in fact slightly more women. But by the time we start looking at the senior ranks in organisations, something like 95% of men on the executive boards of our FTSE 350, so the biggest companies in the organisation, are men. And I can't believe that 95% of men are better than women. And therefore we have got to address why women don't perceive themselves to be willing or able to take those sorts of top jobs. It's a really serious problem for our economy. I think there are lots of reasons why organisations don't address equal pay, but one of the key things that stops them is around fear. I think there is a view that if we don't know about something, it can't hurt us. But organisations also are concerned about the resources that they have to deal with it. And I have had clients say to me, well, there's not much point in us doing an audit because even if we found out we had a problem, we don't have the financial resources to deal with it. But nowadays, there are so many issues around social media. And where organisations have reviews posted on websites like Glassdoor, they are very trusted by other employees. Social media sites are seen as very real. And so what can happen is that you might have issues about equal pay in your organisation which you're ignoring and not addressing, but those start to go out into the open world through the advent of social media, and it's extremely hard to control. So I would urge organisations to think very carefully before they put it to the end of their shopping list. One of the things that I think is a real game changer question for organisations is, what would you do if a quota was introduced? So if we followed suit of the Scandinavian countries and said, in 3 years' time, you have to have 40% of your senior teams have to be female, what would you do? And I think just asking that question and looking at how it addresses issues around recruitment, around promotion, around training, is a really helpful way of introducing some more flexible thinking. And it's not unreasonable that it might happen. Other countries have explored it, and sometimes I feel that quotas are the only way to do it. We've had 40 years of trying to equalise pay and career opportunities for men and women, and really we haven't seen any major effect.